Okay, guys, we're going paragraph by paragraph of Book 2, the rough, woof draft. So, Chapter 1, Child of Death. Thomas sat listlessly against the wall. It was cold, damp, machine stone, a constant reminder of the austerity of the life he now lived, a life he hardly believed worth living. All his family, all of his friends, his loved ones, were all dead. The life he once lived completely obliterated from existence. The irradiated soil of the world above the world, the world above, would guard against exploration for many decades to come, perhaps millennia. Next paragraphs. Why me? Thomas said aloud to himself in the empty causeway. His brooding placed him upon a knife's edge, a reality that he could not fathom. This man, a person whose name he still did not fully know or understand, endured endless torture to pull one man out of an inevitable demise. He was supposed to die there. The scientist, whose maddened, crazy, abnormal consciousness had robbed Thomas of the absence of his own existence. If Thomas had thrown all of this away, it was an insult. Something his savior had worked for what seemed like an eternity to accomplish would have been for naught. Had his savior paid for Thomas's life? Thomas now loved this man and simultaneously hated him. For Thomas was now alive in the bleakness of humanity's extinction, a fate he despised. But his savior had endured endless torture, emotional agony, physical pain, hopelessness. In between these paths, Thomas sat in the causeway, unable to discern truth from reality. My life is nothing, he said, his voice trailing off, thinking about the time machine. Suddenly a thought came to him, that very thought that the scientist had hoped would grow into the chance he saw in Thomas's eyes. Wait, Thomas said, furrowing his brow in perplexed thought. This thing is a time machine. Thomas straightened up. Maybe I can change this. Emily had gathered herself, we're onto a new section of the story, to a reborn composure, perhaps seated in a deep resentment for an effort that was without gain and with only pain. Her terror and anger, disgust and pity, now muted in a stone-cold affect. The scene now shifted from Eden before, showed the scientist curled up in agony upon the floor of his time dilation chamber, an inception of whispers and echoes of eternal consciousness being transferred to Emily's perception. There was no movement as she stared at him for several moments, outwardly emotionless. This stony demeanor was only possible through the ossification of millions of lives, eyes terrifying in their unsaid despair. There is only one path, Thomas said, refusing to look away so as not to betray the honored memory of what he prayed in his heart was to happen. Here, he was the curator, the custodian of the unset fate. In the infinitude of all choices Emily could make, this point, here and now, was the crux of all possible eternities. Stand up, Emily whispered, and it was at those words that the scientist jolted, carrying out the scene before them as had been seen. Emily's resentment was now composure, the culmination of her utter disgust with the scientist's efforts, in full faith that neither she nor anyone else was worth his eternal suffering. What better way to make him pay for how she felt, he thought, than to chide him into continuing. to give him hope in emptiness. She had, in essence, become the embodiment of hatred for the scientist, now sadistically and silently taking pleasure in his pain, which would have ended prematurely had she said nothing to let him die. Thomas, who was expecting this to happen, nodded his head slightly and made toward the exit of his and Emily's chamber. Emily did not say a word, nor did she turn from her stare at the scientist, whose scene continued to play out before her. As Thomas left the chamber, a dark force seeped into the room. It seemed to jump from the scientist's chamber into Emily's, aware of the invisible observation, whatever this force was. While Emily noticed this, her focus remained trained on the scientist, as a foreign word seeped into her mind. This thing, whatever it was, wanted to play with its food, and Emily offered up the opportunity to infinitely extend the struggle. Delicious. The foreign word overwhelmed Emily's mind. What had caused the scientist to writhe in agony and despair now seemed to cause Emily to react as if she had jumped into a cold river on an early spring morning, simultaneously shocking and invigorating her. Where the scientist had rejected, she had been receptive. This force now maliciously fed into her mind. It was a psychic drone, to which she grew rapidly and increasingly adapted. The dark, malevolent substrate proved to be to her liking. Emily calmly and contentedly made her way to the console. She had no training on how the system worked, with its many gauges and wide array of variables, but she figured if she putzed around long enough, she would eventually land upon the correct combination of movements to achieve her end goal. But as she peered upon it was clear that its creator intended it to be very intuitive, with most of its gauges' purposes being stated in plain English upon them as their names. One gauge, for instance, was called Geographic Slider and was of a raster design. There were, in fact, several of these, each with differing resolutions and magnitudes. A very, very brief synopsis of The Art of Knowing by Chris Langan is that it is expositions on free will, as is very clearly stated in the title of the book. But the most important thing, I think, is that the book is written more or less in plain English. And if you were to compare that against the cognitive theoretic model of the universe, or the CTMU uses a lot of neologisms, as Chris Dindo mentioned to me a while back, a couple days ago. And that's the most accurate way to describe it. The book, The Art of Knowing, does still have some neologisms in it, neologisms, however you pronounce it, but it's much easier to understand, much easier to digest. So I like it that it's not very opaque. Another one of these gauges was labeled Temporal Slider, in the same fashion. Both selections had digital readouts that, while clearly numbers, had no easily discernible units or scale. Because of this, Emily, being a very intelligent woman, knew that she would have to iteratively shift the mechanisms to find her intended point of landing. She did know, however, that the scientist's existential point was now at the edge of the universe, perhaps millions of years in the past. Or was it? The scientist was observing that existential point, but was he there? Putting together the puzzle strained her thinking to the very limits of her capabilities, but she knew she would need to look empirically. And with this newfound fervor, born out of her joy at her resentment of the scientist, she knew she could search for however long it took, however many infinite permutations there might be. She knew that it was this history of the scientist, at this point, in the arc of his life that she would need to effectuate her implantation to maximize his torture through his story. She would need to follow him, specifically while he roamed this chamber. Just then, she noticed a golden-colored button with the word anchor plastered upon it. She clicked it hesitantly, causing a holographic prompt to arise in 3 dimensions asking, "Are you sure you would like to set an anchor for your future travel?" She reached out and touched the yes option, and this immediately caused the prompt to disappear from view, and a 3-dimensional crosshair appeared in its place, looking like a pseudo-coordinate system with a translucent cube surrounding it. Emily was surprised at the complexity, yet user-friendly design, as she naturally understood that she could manipulate, there's a typo here, that she could manipulate the movement of the coordinate cube with her hands. She walked over to it and shoved it in one direction with her left hand. It moved as if it were a ball upon the ground, starting rapidly until it steadily came to rest about 15 feet from where it started. Following the force vector Emily had put upon it. The 1 square foot cube came to rest next to the scientist's torso, on his left side, where the stone of the wall was. Scanning the console, however, she saw a button labeled reversion. Was that a type of undo mechanism? She clicked it hesitantly, and another holographic prompt appeared before her saying, Are you sure you would like to regress from the previous action? Yes, no. She closed her eyes in preparation for the coming disorientation of the machine's movement and waved her hand over the yes choice. She heard the loud whirring of what she thought were more than likely rapidly spinning gyroscopes, and likely dozens of them. She had been so focused on the visuals that she had not noticed their sound before now, likely from herself being in some type of sensory overload. In her fumbling about to discern the ins and outs of the device, she inadvertently pressed a temporal dislocation button upon the console, one that was many orders of magnitude beyond anything that she had effectuated before, causing the scene to zoom several 100 billion years into the future. She noticed that a cube of stone remained in the same location relative to its surroundings for only a sliver of that time, as the chamber rapidly crumbled to dust and the original anchor became indifferentiable from the rest of the surroundings. That is, aside from an ever-shrinking stone that at this juncture was whizzing across the entire globe, occasionally floating in the ocean, then settling on land, floating in the air even. This continued dizzyingly until the stone had completely disappeared, and now the anchor cube was following a single atom once the temporal shift settled. Emily felt sick. The room had shifted so rapidly that she was completely disoriented and had the urge to vomit. She did, however, regain her composure after a handful of relative seconds. This, combined with the ominous feeling of the dark force in the chamber to which she had such a peculiar affinity, was a unique medley of sensations that would only coalesce in any machine like this one. She thought, what a truly rare opportunity. Or, as was implanted in her mind before, it was a delicious opportunity. She moved over to the cube and gently placed her hands on opposing sides of it, now experimenting with its motion. Once she was satisfied that she understood how to manipulate and anchor it, she returned to the console. How would she get back to where she had just been, with the scientist with her before? There were infinite streams of both time and space that were an impassable gulf between the two of them now. And the entropy and disorder of the anchor she previously had, she was not sure the machine was capable of reestablishing that anchor from what was now probably a single atom, or a handful of atoms. Once the whirring subsided, she reopened her eyes, and the scientist was once again before her. She would not make that mistake again, and cause the timeline to spin out of control. Though, if she had her way, she would not remain in this machine much longer. She then went to the anchor and manipulated it based upon what she had learned. She thought of where best to place it for a moment, as she knew she would need to follow the path of the scientist, upon whom this entire charade appeared to be rotating. A mind is a terrible thing to waste, rang through her head as she suddenly knew what to do, with a sadistic smile spreading across her face. She placed the anchor upon the scientist's head, which seemed to fit perfectly within it. And now, knowing what would happen when she manipulated the time dimension, she began doing so on the console, and the three-dimensional projection centered upon the scientist, moving any time he did, even in normal time progression. This was highly disorienting to Emily, who desperately thought of how she might make the scene easier to watch. Scanning the console, she saw a section labeled Projection, and two buttons below it, labeled 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, respectively. The 3 dimensions button was backlit, as if it had been selected. She looked around briefly, assessing the structure of the room and the scene, which was now frozen, and cautiously pressed the 2 dimensions button. Instantly, the scene shifted to a screen projection, as if having her implantation as an observer removed, now giving her a fly-on-the-wall view of the environment. It was a few feet from her and several feet in size. The image Emily had of the scientist had simply been converted to a view screen, as opposed to being immersed in the scene itself. Now, she thought, she could more comfortably spy upon the scientist, find the place to maximize his torture. Who was he to change this world anyway? Silly boy. He would pay for not letting go, as Emily now was a pure carnivore, ready to digest him. His star would set by her last breath. She started moving the scientist's timeline, first in months per minute. Somehow, he remained in the same room, though he was now observing a planet with avian humanoid creatures. He appeared to be fascinated and oddly contented. As Emily periodically slowed time's progression to a normal rate in order to observe him more clearly, this was taking much longer for him than she had anticipated. Even at this rate of progression, the scientist remained observing the avians for well over an hour. Had the scientist really focused this amount of time observing one city of this one species on this one planet in this one frame of time among the infinity of eternity that existed? What a waste, she thought. What was the scientist's filter, she thought? Was this purely whim? Purely preference? All the more reason to put him down for good, out of his misery, the thought resonated through her mind. Finally, the scene regressed to a point in time where the ancient ruins of the avian city were being slowly recovered by a giant glacier, as the mountains in the background reformed and snow covered various regions. Still, let me fix a typo here. Still, Emily ventured backward, the scientist's timeline growing ever more convoluted. She was now following him across the vast expanse of the entire universe, as he ventured from planet to planet, searching for something that, at that moment, she did not know. This, she knew, she must discover. In her chamber, she looked through the workings of her console in order to try to find some documentation of the scientist's journey. But despite what looked to be plenty of space for digital storage, virtually nothing could be found. Was this an intentional obfuscation of some sort on the part of the scientist? It must have been. In the various digital folders, she only found a handful of journal entries, outlining the trauma and heartbreak the scientist had been feeling, but essentially no hard data on his exploits. She could not expedite the process of transgressing the timeline of the scientist in this manner. She could only see how he reacted to it. She would have to take the quote-unquote long way around, however abridged, with the time dilation she could utilize. She would have to observe so much more of it, the life of this man that with every experience she detested more. She, in truth, detested how much she loved him, for how much pain he willingly endured. She would use this as fuel to her resolve to stop him, she thought. So be it. From planet to planet they went, each and every one of them barren, and most of them without a trace of atmosphere. How many had he visited? And for how long, she thought? To what end? The end, clearly, she had seen, but she now controlled it in her own way. She would stop this suffering, shut down the play. Emily knew that the scientist had peered through millions of planets' histories, taking him what would have been hundreds of years under normal circumstances. But nothing here was normal. How could it be? They were dealing with the boundaries of space and time, the edge cases of consciousness's last light in existence, and its extreme and willful outpost as it flared up like a star in supernova at the end of its life. Did this man have a home? Or was his home this everlasting sojourn throughout the cosmos, never to plant roots upon a rocky world again? And it struck Emily. Where did he last have his roots before they were uprooted? That, she thought, was where she needed to land. But she needed to find where and when she would have the greatest impact, where and when she would affect the scientist's fall the fastest. One that he had to choose. There was no other way. It was nevertheless endlessly perplexing to her. How did the scientist have this kind of time and patience, or, dare she think, faith? For so long he had searched, only to be ousted by an unseen parasite that would yet more extend his suffering for its own pleasure. Finally, after following the scientist for thousands of his years, relative to the normal rate of progression of human action, Emily reached what was doubtless some type of origination point. The scientist had exited his machine and was standing on the surface of what was unmistakably Earth, though the buildings, technology, and other elements indicated that it appeared to be somewhere in the 1970s. A member of the United States military police had approached the scientist, whose uniform and bearing were unmistakable. This was despite the fact that the 20-something-year-old man was clearly shaken, downright on the verge of total panic, while addressing the scientist. The buildings in the background appeared severely damaged by some type of weapon bombardment, various chunks of walls missing, and several plots appeared to have been totally collapsed, rubble remaining where the skyscrapers had once been. Where were they? Emily thought. This looked so foreign to her. Just as well as she was certain it was Earth. She observed the dialogue between the two for a few brief moments, noting the tremulous tone and dilated pupils of the young military man, who seemed to know that here and now his fate was sealed, a certain terror of resignation. The scientist listened for a few moments and did not waste any time upon discovery, scurrying inside his chamber, nestled deep within a hillside off distant from the Philadelphia cityscape. This is the city Emily would soon discover. Within seconds of the scientist disappearing into his lair, the doorway dissolved out of existence, leaving a large chasm in its place, to which Emily could not see an end in the shadow of the hillside. The soldier, who had valiantly informed the scientist of the coming end, looked down at his feet in silent terror. He then purposefully began walking back to the base from whence he came, prepared to put up one last defense. He knew it would be fruitless. Emily felt a fury and hatred for this man that almost made her as sick to her stomach as the initial disorientation the chamber had caused. "You little bastard. You don't know when to quit, do you?" she said with a bitter look upon her face. She followed him through the era in order to observe from where he had come, gathering as much reconnaissance as possible for the purposes of snuffing out this insanity once and for all. The soldier, after trudging through several hundred feet of forest area, reached a two-lane road, to the side of which was parked a military Humvee, with one other soldier in the driver's seat. He hopped in the passenger side. "So, you told him what's up?" the driver inquired. "Yeah, he's gone to God knows where, or when," he said with a sigh. "I'm not sure if God is playing any role in this dude," the driver said back, as he started up the vehicle and began driving away, Emily in pursuit within her chamber. The two soldiers looked at each other simultaneously, panicked and resigned to their fates. They had been briefed thoroughly on what was surely to happen, and they knew that there was little to nothing that they could do. Chinese military personnel were already at the United States' shores, storming various parts of the country. It was a kind of kamikaze, and no one could be certain who shot first, only that the end result would be the same. The two of them noticed a pillar of smoke and fire bearing down upon the base. It was the nuclear warhead. There could be little mistaking it. The sound of its approach boomed louder and louder until it began to drown out the sounds of various surrounding aircraft taking off, reaching a crescendo that even surpassed the base's alarms. Seconds before it was sure to make impact, and obviously too late to change the inevitable outcome, various missiles launched from underground silos, most of which very few people even were privy to having existed. A handful of these had trajectories that looked to be an attempt to intercept the incoming nuclear munition, foolishly disregarding the high potential of simply accelerating its detonation, and therefore their demise. Or was it, in fact, disregard? Maybe it was meant to hasten the inevitable? It mattered little at this juncture. The rest of the missiles shot off in various directions, and one could assume toward strategic enemy targets in a fulfillment of a mutually assured destruction doctrine. This compounded idiocy only infuriated Emily more. Nuclear munitions fired upon soldiers of both armies? What wanton eschewing of the value of human life? This fury that Emily felt, however, caused a devilish smile to spread across her face, as she had yet more justification for the actions she desired to carry out herself. "If you insist upon your own extinction, far be it from me to get in your way," she said aloud to herself. As the scientist had made so painfully obvious, there's a typo here, there's no changing Wait, hold on. That was correct. There's no changing your mind, so I might as well help. You deserve to get what you want anyway, right? She spoke gleefully as the nuclear missile continued its descent. The two soldiers to which Emily had been anchored both tensed up and closed their eyes tightly in unison, praying to themselves for a quick and painless demise. No one's coming to save you, you son of a bitches. Sons of bitches, pardon me. Emily whispered to herself, watching them reciting those same prayers quietly to themselves. Just then, the bomb struck a spot in the middle of the base with impressive precision, especially for the era. As a blinding flash illuminated the environment, the chamber's view screen automatically adjusting to prevent Emily from going blind. And to the hopes of the two soldiers, the shockwave blew their vehicle away as it tumbled across the road, past the ditch on their other side, and then farther beyond. Where it would rest was unknown, but as the vegetation in the area immediately combusted, Emily knew they were not long for this world. She was surprised they, along with their vehicle and the rest of the base, didn't simply vaporize. The bomb must have been smaller yield. She didn't know much about this base, but it must have been a less strategic target than the others, as she salivated internally at the thought of the devastation other more important locations must have experienced. Well, I'm loving this light show. I can't get any information from a pile of ash, she said aloud to herself. She paused the scene mid-immolation and began moving it backward. Go inside the entry control point, the thought flowed through her mind, notably foreign in texture. Nevertheless, she happily listened to it and did it as it commanded. Emily froze the scene to the moment the two soldiers had reached the compound. She then adjusted her location to inside the entry control point, where 3 more soldiers, in flak vests and carrying weapons, resided. One of the men manned a computer mechanism that was half the size of the kiosk that was the control point, and it produced a digital readout of green text upon a screen about 12 inches in diagonal size. This man appeared to be typing something, mid-command. The other 2 soldiers were tensely watching a news anchor on a black and white television, an anchor who looked to be reporting on an emergency, no doubt related to what the alarm system of the base had been blaring. As with the 2 soldiers in the vehicle, Emily had just been observing. These soldiers in the kiosk must have also been resigned to their fates, knowing that there was no escaping it. Read the message. That man is writing on that machine, the thought jolted through Emily's mind, ironically leading her to think, why didn't I think of that? Subsequently, Emily adjusted the view to see what the 3rd soldier was typing into the computer. Curiously, it didn't look to be any type of command or computer code. It looked to instead be a plain text message on some type of internal communication relay. Emily had never seen anything like it before. The message read, "Attention, Lieutenant Colonel Behringer, CC Alcon FOUO, TSSCI. PFC Drummel and Staff Sergeant Braddock have returned ECP Bravo 1108 hours estimated indicating message relayed to Scientist James Black. No time to confirm further detail. Nuclear munitions overhead, inbound. Impact estimated to occur at Lat Long at 11:10 hours. This will be our final mess." Emily contemplated what she was reading for a moment, searching her memories. She had heard the name Behringer before, but only in passing, and only in a short time she had been in the looking glass. It had to be someone working with the scientist. But who was this person? It clearly was related in some way, but how? And was the knowledge too so replete that even this, oh, this man at the large computer was rather high rank to be working at an ECP. Emily did not know much about the military, but she recognized his captain rank, and knew that it was usually low-level grunts and military police that did such menial jobs as monitoring base entry points. Let him finish writing the message, another foreign thought blared through Emily's mind. She squirmed in slight agitation, getting frustrated that she felt impelled to do something she was going to do anyway. Why was she getting irritated, though? Were these thoughts not within her own mind? They were owned by her, weren't they? She hesitated for a moment and then shrugged it off. A palpable dark aura in her chamber. It not only surrounded her now, but emanated from her. And even within the pitch-black chamber, it was somehow visible. Emily unpaused the scene, knowing that this was only seconds before the munition would touch down. Thus, she slowed time further beyond its normal progression in order to better absorb every detail. The captain slowly adjusted into a hesitant position, clearly contemplating what he was about to do, whether he should or not. After a moment, he then began typing again in the CC line. Carbon copy. CC, Major General Donnelly Craig, Base Commander, USAF. Emily again paused the scene. This was a crucial piece of information, one she could use, perhaps to figure out the next logical course of action. She needed to find this commander. He no doubt would be a wealth of knowledge and information. She adjusted the geographic location and was now observing inside the base. As with most military bases, with constantly deploying and moving personnel, clear, easy-to-follow base directions were a must. And no more than a quarter mile down the entry road was a T intersection with a sign posted about it, listing building numbers, one of which was the headquarters building. She did not think much of it at first, but then the pressure of another foreign thought came about her. Where do base commanders normally reside? She stopped for a moment and thought, and then said to herself, in the headquarters building, of course. She searched the scene, transferring it back into a three-dimensional projection in order to improve her perception of it, still frozen in time. While the sign said the various buildings on the base and their numbers, let me fix this real quick. It did not list directions. There was, however, a visitor information building just inside the entry control point. She rushed over to it with the chamber, went inside, and began searching. Surely this building had a base map somewhere. She looked at what was apparently an administration desk, manned by a singular female policewoman, looking studiously down at some notes on her in front of her. Her desk enclosed by a guest counter with various pieces of paper and pens strewn about. She zoomed over to it to observe closer what the contents of some of these documents were. Ah, eureka! A base map pile, she thought, seeing a file stack designated as such. It was covered by a manila folder, obscuring her view. She knew that she needed to obtain this document, lest she be searching the base aimlessly for perhaps many hours from her perspective. She had already grown irritated enough having watched the scientists search perhaps millions of worlds in the endless void. She had no more patience for moving without direction, and therefore chose to work smarter as opposed to harder. Looking at her console, which had been intuitive up to this point, she searched for a way to enter the scene, knowing she would need to do so in order to get the information she needed. She saw a button labeled Witness/Experience. Approach it. A foreign thought bore down upon her. "Shut up," she said to herself. "I was going to already." She knew without knowing that these foreign thoughts were not her own, and was beginning to get annoyed by their prompting, as if traumatized by what she had witnessed already, into a schizophrenic fervor. This, the witness of the witness, may have been forgiven for thinking. Emily, nevertheless, approached the distortion and cautiously placed her hand upon it, then touched it, or what she thought was touching it, as it felt no different than before. That is, other than a slight difference in temperature from that of the chamber, which felt as if it were kept at a comfortable 70 degrees Fahrenheit. It was autumn time in the northeast of the United States, the era and location she was observing during mid-morning. She thought to herself that this must have been where she was getting a sensation of briskness, even in the relatively climate-controlled information booth. And she was certain, having confirmed empirically, that this shimmering section of the chamber was going to allow her direct, tangible access to the scene. She wanted only one thing, single-mindedly trained upon the map, as she stepped through the portal. The scene remained frozen, and she felt a strange sensation of pressure upon her face and body that increased steadily as she walked toward the folder and placed her hand on it. For some reason beyond her understanding, the weight of all her movements began increasing to nearly unbearable levels. Nevertheless, she managed to pull open the folder and retrieve one of the pieces of paper with the base map printed upon it. She then walked back to the portal through which she had entered. It seemed to beckon her toward it, almost sucking her body back through the path she had taken. As she reemerged within her chamber, she looked down at the sheet of paper. "What the?" she said, stunned and exasperated. The paper was blurry, beyond legibility. Emily, unable to make out even the depiction of the largest buildings, let alone the tiny font descriptions. Unpause the scene, the thought pulsed through her mind. Unpause the scene? She thought, confused. What for? She asked this rhetorically as she began walking back toward the control console, having no other ideas of what to do. She might as well try it. And as she did, a massive sonic boom emanated from the scene, causing Emily to yell in fright, heart rate skyrocketing as her fight-or-flight reflexes kicked into overdrive. At the same time, the paper in her hand immediately burst into flames as she dropped it in surprise. She frantically began to observe the scene more closely, and the military personnel in view were all terrified in the same manner that Emily was, a couple of them bending over in defensive positions. "What the fuck was that?" one of them exclaimed. The personnel in the building were already in the process of evacuating, with the alarm blaring loudly through the intercom system. In all the briefings and trainings they had attended in preparation for what was now happening to them, this was beyond anything that they had ever learned. Still stunned at the transgression of events, Emily looked back at the pile of maps from which she had drawn the burning paper at her feet. It was smoking, sizzling in whatever aftermath she seemed to have affected. Several of the sheets of flying about as if blown by a powerful gust of air. Emily knew there were still only precious seconds before the main event would come to pass, so she either needed to figure out what happened first, or if it happened fast, or repause the scene once again, which was becoming laborious to her. There was only so much she could learn from a frozen scene. Perhaps she could slow it down, though, she thought. She needed all the relative time she could get, with fate bearing down heavily upon these soldiers. Sure enough, the temporal gauges did have a portion dedicated to just this, deprecated in magnitude decreasing knobs. It did in fact go both ways, but then, was transgression of time ever truly fully frozen? She did not know, but shirked off the thought, not wanting to waste more of her precious moments pondering. She was going to do, not simply think. She slowed down the movement of the scene so that each of her moments was equivalent to 20 of the scenes. An odd sight to behold. The smoke billowing from the stack of maps gently danced about as the soldiers' faces morphed from one emotion to another. Emily now able to observe the transitions with greater fidelity than she ever knew possible. The sonic boom must have been caused by something, but what? She was at a loss when suddenly yet another of the great many foreign thoughts she knew she was having thrust upon her swam ever so gracefully into the substructure of her conscience. This one, for lack of a better term, having decidedly different texture to it than the last. Everything in the scene, including the air itself, is affected by your accelerated motion. This thought, while informative, disgusted Emily, as her body filled with rejection and resentment. She knew, however, that it must be right, and minimally cared of its source. It was the end goal to her that superseded all extraneous emotion. How similar she was to the scientist in this regard, she thought to herself with a chuckle. Emily, though highly intelligent, let me fix this, only had a working, cursory understanding of complex physics and engineering, but she knew that the speed of sound dictated by the medium through which it traversed was roughly 750 miles per hour, that air friction can cause spontaneous combustion of certain materials, and that sonic booms occurred when relative motion compressed air past the speed of sound. This, she thought, must have been what happened. This meant that so long as she slowed down the time within a certain range, she should be able to attain her end, especially if she herself did not move excessively rapidly. 3 miles per hour walking, speed multiplied by a factor of 20, was well below the speed of sound, but would still produce a significant gust of wind in a tight space. Therefore, she would have to minimize extraneous movements. She kept these things in mind as she re-entered the slowed down, though still progressing, scene. "Look over there," one of the stunned soldiers said to the others, who lifted their heads up from their frantic work of evacuation, looking in the direction the alerting soldier was pointing. A rapidly moving black silhouette in the shape of a person was rushing toward the stack of maps. "What the hell is going on here?" one of the soldiers said, bewildered by the rapid sequence of events they had just experienced. First, a sonic boom while an evacuation was occurring, and now a ghostly apparition appearing out of thin air. "We don't have time," another soldier said. "We need to get to Bunker Bravo right now." Emily grabbed the sheet of paper from the pile. It was hot to the touch, though not unbearably so. She noticed as she moved back to her portal that the map was also more legible than before, yet still somewhat blurry. When she finally made it back to her chamber, watching the soldiers as if they were walking in molasses, she could just barely make out the word headquarters on a sheet of paper, until finally she returned the scene's progression back to normal, real time. Perhaps the other things blew about in the scene, serving only to distract her. "What a mess," she said with disdain, irritated with a cacophony of confusion, the soldiers seeming to move with an aimless fervor. "Wait," she thought. "That nuke is still inbound. I need to conserve these moments." And yet again she froze the scene, this time being careful not to displace anything within it to any significant degree, while she may have been in it. She was in the chamber now, however, so there shouldn't be a problem. She eagerly looked at the map in her hand, and emblazoned across it She saw several building depictions, with a legend in small font in the bottom of the page. She scanned it rapidly. There it was, Building 650, toward the center rear of the compound, due north from this entry control point. Emily wasted no time, zooming the chamber in that direction, not even taking the time to remove the three-dimensional projection. There was no external anchor and time was paused, though, so it wasn't an issue. There it was, a large, brutalist-style brick building with several military Humvees in front of the main entrance. Large blacktop parking lots on either side, nearly devoid of cars, as most personnel had already fled or were in the process of doing so. The Humvees out front were the last contingent trying to collect stragglers and important documents that may have been missed. Emily knew that this was pointless, seeing the nuclear munition only a few hundred feet above them. They must have been unaware. She was thinking primarily of the scientist, though undoubtedly this was true for Thomas, and all of his acolytes as well. This, of course, meant AFMARS, whatever it was, could not have been far away. Look at the punch cards. A voice rang through her head. What? Why? She asked, fully at peace. It seemed, with the steady stream of thoughts coming to her that did not have the texture of her own. Whatever. It was probably just speeding her along decisions she was already going to make. She couldn't stay here, she knew. No matter how inexorably connected to the scientist and Thomas this general may have been, he was still an abstracted and distant reality and timeline from him. This era was where the scientist started his pursuit. Logically, it only made sense that he would come back to it at some point. Thomas was the next step she would take in order to loop back on the scientist, whom she only needed to find once. With that, she could connect to all of his realities. His repeating presence upon this era was a pattern in the noise, an unacceptable pattern that Emily could not allow to persist. She started toward the punch cards. This time she knew not to attempt to confiscate them while the scene was frozen, lest they burst into flames. Lo and behold, however, she had no need to do so. The writing upon the sheets were perfectly legible from her perspective. Emily zoomed through the entrance, materializing through the glass doorways. She looked about in the anteroom, yet more soldiers scurrying about on the verge of panic. Upon one of the walls, as was customary in military compounds, were portraits of several key leaders of the base, along with several from generations past. And before the President and the Secretary of Defense of the United States was the portrait of a man who looked to be in his early 50s, in Air Force service dress, 2 stars on either shoulder, the name Donnelly scrawled across a silvery name tag upon his chest. "That's him," Emily said. This was the first image of him she had yet seen, and was another crucial reference point for her. Where was he? Past the anteroom and administrative desk, there was a hallway to the right. Emily approached it in her chamber, again without hesitation. A list of names with room numbers was on the wall to the left of the hallway, just above the administrative desk. Major General Craig Donnelly, room 322. She looked about the room numbers of the hallway. They were all labeled in the 100s. The first number must have been designated as the floor, she thought. And this was a 3-story building. She zoomed methodically down the hallway, most of the offices showing signs of being hurriedly abandoned with various papers strewn about. One room even had a spilt cup of coffee upon its desk, with physical training clothes drenched in stale sweat all over the ground. Halfway through the hallway, Emily spotted the entrance to a stairwell. She could have just as easily used the chamber to teleport her up to the 3rd floor, but instead chose to follow the traveled route, hoping to gather yet more vital information on the situation, and possibly the daily routines of some of the building's personnel. Such an incredibly powerful tool she had at her disposal, she thought. It was a shame that it was all for nothing, as she would destroy it all. She reached the 3rd floor, and down the hallway to her left was a large office with a glass door protecting a foyer. Written in frosted lettering across the glass read Major General Craig Donnelly, Base Commander. "There we are," Emily said happily, heading over to gather yet more information. Through the foyer, Emily saw an open door to another office, large windows to the outside revealing the ensuing chaos. A man was standing in there. Was this the general? If so, why was he still here? The supposed most important person on the base. Astonished by this turn of events, Emily zoomed to get a closer look at the tall, slender man. He was donning military fatigues, his face forlorn, as if resigned to his fate, going down with his metaphorical ship, as naval commanders of past eras would do. This compound was his Air Force, modern-day surrogate, as useful as it may have been. "You must be the only sane person here," Emily said condescendingly. "You're the only one willing to accept that it is hopeless to try. I guess I should commend you, maybe give you a medal," she said sarcastically. She spoke as if the general could hear her, hoping to aggravate his internal turmoil further. She then turned away from him in disgust, looking about the room for more accessible intel. One wall of the general's spacious office was completely covered by a machine with spinning platters of magnetic tape. At least Emily assumed they spun by their shape, as the scene was still frozen, and a CRT screen with green text written upon it. Additionally, a series of punch cards with plain English text were dispensing from below this screen. "Go to the screen. You will find a familiar name there," the voice whispered through her mind. "So be it," she said begrudgingly. She zoomed toward the screen. Several names on a list shined at her in green, digital lettering. It showed their ranks, locations, associated commands, and various other vital information in table format. It looked to be a part of some internal communications relay, probably the same one she had encountered at the entry control point only moments ago. There it was, the name she recognized beyond a shadow of a doubt, toward the bottom of the screen. Thomas Behringer, Lieutenant Colonel, AFMARS. At the very bottom of the screen was a flashing phrase that said, "Access granted, all." They must have used the internal communications relay for providing access to data repositories at a distance, she thought. But AFMARS, what was that? And more importantly, where was it? She knew this is where she would need to go next, Thomas being a breadcrumb she could not ignore, that she knew would lead her to her goal. Conveniently, there was a map of the local area sprawled across the general's desk, situated near the large window, and to which's left side he was standing. It was held messily in place by several paperweights, pins, and writing utensils strewn about it. Clearly the general, and perhaps his cohorts, had been scouring it before the scourge of panic and hellfire overwhelmed them all. A handful of red X's written in marker were on the map. They must have denoted critical targets or maybe local-based geographic locations. It would make sense that the general would want to map out the local terrain in relation to base locations. The Chinese armies were already ashore, and nuclear fallout had a nasty habit of following wind patterns. She needed to find this AFMAR's location. Surely it was close. And how serendipitous that this general knew Thomas. Emily, up to this point, had not been aware that he had once served in the American military. All the more reason to hate him, she thought. I suppose it makes sense, she said. He would need to work in a pretty close proximity in order to reduce the variables he would need to deal with. She then went back to the map upon the general's desk, and sure enough, there were the numbers in close approximation to what she had read on that punch card lining the map, which was demarcated in a grid for simpler navigation. She matched the numbers listed by Thomas's name with the corresponding grid location on the map. Marked upon the exact location, just outside downtown Philadelphia, was a large red X with the letters CL in green lettering written just to the side of it. And yet another red X was no more than 1/10 of a mile away from the one over Thomas's location, based upon the map's scale. Wow. Whatever's here must be really important to someone, Emily said with a sinister smile on her face as she gave a glance at the general. Yes, indeed. The foreign thought surged through her mind, causing goosebumps to emerge across her arms and back. How exhilarating. The base where Emily currently was located had a blue X upon it. They were, from the looks of it, roughly 35 miles to the southwest of the point where Thomas was indicated to be. Simple enough, Emily thought to herself. Let's go do some more exploring. Emily was truly beginning to get the hang of this machine as her manipulation at the console steadily produced more and more precise movements in time and geography. Whereas at first she inadvertently caused the machine to travel billions of years into the future, now she was able to real-time manipulate its geographic position to within a few feet in frozen time. To her, this whole journey had only been a few hours so far, most of that time watching the scientist putz around aimlessly from planet to planet. These thoughts floated through the back of her mind while she delicately traversed the distance, leaving the general and his office behind. It was too bad she would have to leave this device behind in order to get to her goal. The view gave way to yet more blasted buildings. Emily looked overhead. There were more jets scrambled in the sky, and trails of missiles being shot from batteries. Hundreds of people were frozen mid-run before her in the foreground, some carrying M4 rifles, others speaking rapidly into radios or to each other. Still others were attempting to usher civilians to safer locations, but it was clear that no one would escape. It's fun watching their helpless pursuits, she said. She did, after all, chide the scientist into his own infinite oblivion. She searched from left to right. The soldiers seemed to be pouring out of a location somewhere to the left. Thomas, being a high-ranking soldier himself, would probably be somewhere near this nexus of events. As Emily zoomed in that location, she noticed it was slightly more forested, large coniferous trees lining the main thoroughfare, with deciduous ones also mildly interspersed throughout. A few relatively intact 3 to 6-story buildings lay beyond. Emblazoned across the bottom floor of one of them, on the corner of an intersection, were the words, Philadelphia Local Contingent, apparently a kiosk for those purposes. AFMARS must have been nearby. To the right of this kiosk, however, Emily saw a handful of soldiers flowing from a multi-story complex, clad in a clash of modern glass exterior and Cape Cod business architecture. There were 2 people in lab coats draped over military fatigues, as if this was a field hospital. Emily thought this peculiar, but this was a peculiar time as well. Why wouldn't there be a military hospital next to a military urban outpost? Thomas watched Emily from his chamber intently. "You're close, Emily," he said to himself. He then knelt near Emily's ear in a three-dimensional projection of the scene and whispered. "Go in there," he said, fully aware that she was focusing upon the medical facility. Thomas's presence was ethereal, as if standing in the space between space, infinitely close to Emily, while simultaneously infinitely far away. He, of course, unfroze the scene momentarily in order to insert the thought into her psyche in pseudo-real time. A voice creeped through Emily's mind once again, and once again had a most detestable texture to it. Her face contorted in anger, tiring of the steady barrage of alien commands sent to her from a source that disgusted her. But, for all she knew, it was her own mind. It probably was, she thought, as she battled an internal Gemini syndrome. What other choices did she have? She could spend an infinite amount of time in this frozen scene, meaning that eventually she would explore it one way or another. She might as well do it now. She zoomed over to the medical facility's entrance and peered into the large glass windows upon its edifice. Inside, she observed row after row of military hospital beds and various pieces of sophisticated medical devices dotted about. Nearly every bed was occupied by children? Why? She parsed the scene in her mind. This was a military facility, not a children's hospital. At least this is how it appeared. She agonized over what she saw, looking for clues as to the significance of this, when suddenly she saw two people near the back of the large room. One looked to be rather tall, slender man of olive-colored skin. The other, a still tall woman with dark hair. Wait, was that man Thomas? Eureka! This was the first crucial step she sought to achieve, she thought, watching as Thomas and his female companion seemed to be ushering the children to a doorway at the back of the room. Emily zoomed over toward him. She whispered rhetorically to her silent audience, "Why even try to get these kids out of this room? Thomas, what's the point? They're gonna die anyway." "I remember that, Emily. You will see. You will see," Thomas whispered as he watched Emily's observation from his own chamber. "Never give up, even if you don't know what to do, or it seems hopeless." "Fucking bastard," Emily said to this foreign thought. "I'm going to show you how pointless it all is, even if you refuse to see it." Emily tensed up, trying to control her overflowing anger. She unfroze the scene momentarily in order to absorb the ensuing events as how Thomas, at his personal point of primogenesis, reacted to them. We didn't have a chance to figure out a cure, god damn it. Thomas the Younger said, sirens blaring in the background. The woman, who was gathering what materials she could, paused her frantic movement and gazed helplessly into Thomas's eyes. Surely he, our champion, couldn't be without direction, even now. Was this really the end? Thomas looked into the woman's eyes as well, intently. Emily could tell that there was a deep, unspoken love between the two of them. Lives apparently always too full of activity for them to ever have capitalized on their genuine connection. He could not let this be the end, and if it were, he would not let them die without hope. He had already directed most of his assistants to rustle the children and carry those who could not carry themselves. Maybe Thomas was finally succumbing to the constant tragic circumstances, but he had many spurious thoughts to have the children go through the forested area behind the building. Missing any other inclination, this gentle nudging was the only guidance he imagined he had. So he followed it. What was that? Emily reeled in thought. Was that a figure she saw standing next to Thomas? Almost as if a mirage out of the corner of her eye. There she saw a black figure for a split second. She decided to let the scene play out for a few more seconds in an attempt to get another glimpse. There it was again, a black silhouette of a human-looking figure, a tallish man, though not quite as tall as Thomas. This happened a few more times, and each time it did, Thomas had a slight jolt in his affect, as if being prompted by it. As they finally made it to the beginning of the forested area, with what looked to be around 30 children in tow, it happened one last time. Emily managed to freeze the scene the very moment it occurred. She then zoomed herself directly next to the silhouette to get a closer look. Getting closer, however, did not yield more clarity to the image, as if it were a human being phasing only partially into existence. A very noisy signal with no other distinguishable pattern. She did gather, though, that the silhouette looked to be some strange cross of two-dimensional and three-dimensional, as if one's shadow cast on a surface was halfway through the process of suddenly standing up from that surface. There was no real edge to it, but it stood out of the surroundings. As the congregation was again unpaused by Emily, she could see Chinese soldiers storming the area behind the horizon, or beyond, pardon me. Utter mayhem was ensuing, as if the very gates of hell had suddenly opened and all catastrophes were happening at once in a drastically collapsed time frame. Moments later, once Thomas had reached an impasse and lost any semblance of direction, a silhouette again appeared, then materialized into a man. He was wearing a gas mask, large green trench coat, and carried a scimitar in one hand. He had some type of assault rifle in the other. As he appeared, undoubtedly a man from his stature and size, he beckoned Thomas toward him to follow him, a white dove fluttering by in a paradoxical kind of unison. Surely, as if Emily had thought of the numerous times she had been nudged in the infinite spectrum of possibilities at her disposal to go in one particular direction, Thomas may have had a similar mentality to her. What else was she going to do? This was uncharted territory to him, and he was punching in the dark, all in order to give hope to others. He kept none for himself. At least not yet. But this man, appearing from the ether, as if from nothingness itself, gave him some type of hope. Folly. It must have been folly. But was there a connection? Emily thought to herself in this situation of high strangeness, as to many paranormal researchers of her era would call it. No doubt about it. This was Thomas at his beginning, and therefore that masked man was probably the scientist. She watched him guide the congregation through the forested area, when moments later a cloud of green-tinted gas exploded behind Thomas, knocking him down. All those following him had expired, or were in the agony of the process after this explosion, choking as the green gas destroyed their lungs and melted their flesh. So many children, such unimaginable suffering. Emily watched as Thomas reconstituted himself, viewed what had happened, then collapsed to his knees, sobbing and wailing at what had just happened. Even Emily, in her sadistic fervor, was taken aback by what she witnessed. God, couldn't they have just put the kids out of their misery more humanely? She said aloud, wincing and turning her head at the grotesque sight. Her discomfort severely compounded by seeing Thomas, the only leader here, in such a sorry state. Emily may have wanted him to stop his pursuit, but to do so with dignity. This was just painful to watch. The scientist looked back and hesitated for a moment, observing what had just happened, only long enough, it seemed, for him to discern his next logical course of action. He then rushed towards Thomas and drug him as he continued to writhe in despair. He was dead weight, paying almost no heed to this masked man, the man who was dragging him by the collar of his military fatigues, buried under a soiled lab coat. The scientist, as if acting on instinct, or perhaps mechanically, followed a path along the forested area with zero contemplation or stoppage. No doubt he had seen this area many a time before. This was purely muscle memory to him. After dragging Thomas for roughly 500 feet, the scientist came to a vault door, nestled within a small mound of elevated terrain, shrouded in yet more trees. He entered a code upon a keypad that was covered in brush, and the vault door opened suddenly, revealing a dimly lit passageway with a gentle descent downward. He continued dragging the now despondent, near catatonic Thomas down this passageway that looked to span several hundred feet downward. Emily was in tow, absorbing as much of the scene as possible, intent on discovering the common kernel to this all. Hold on, she thought to herself. This passageway looks oddly familiar. She scoured the mental images she had of all the experiences of her last few days, following what was a prescribed path for her by her now fully obscured better judgment. This was where she herself had originally been brought, or looked like it. The walls were less polished, more roughly carved stone. This must have been a proto-version of the scientist's compound. She must have been introduced to this timeline at some juncture far later in his life. How curious, she thought, to witness such a crude and flawed beginning. The scientist, despite the aura given him by the testimony of so many in his orbit, was still just a man after all. The scientist and Thomas finally made it to the end of the passageway, where they were greeted by a small atrium with more roughly carved walls, and some type of device in one corner that looked like a boxed void. Emily thought, perplexed by the device for which she had no prior frame of reference. A cable dangled from it, as if some type of conduit connected to the power infrastructure of this facility. A quiet, though audible buzzing emanated from the device. Thomas was plopped down in the atrium, while the scientist lurched over unsteadily into one of the adjoining rooms, opening a heavy metal door. He then began peeling off his overcoat, mask, and another layer of clothing beneath. He was drenched in sweat, no doubt from what was a Herculean effort on his part. This Herculean effort, no one really knew one way or another if it made even a modicum of difference. The scientist, undressed all the way down to his underwear, was panting in exhaustion as he sat upon the military-style cot in his room, eyes wild in bewilderment. As adrenaline pumped through his veins, he continued taking large gulps of air in order to regain what little composure he had left. "They died, Thomas. But you didn't," the scientist said as he curled up into a ball and passed out on his meager sleeping spot. Emily continued to observe the scene in deep contempt for both of them. Maybe Thomas was finally succumbing to the constant tragic circumstances, but he had many spurious thoughts. To have the children go through the forested area behind the building, missing any other inclination, this gentle nudging was the only guidance he imagined he had. So he followed it. What was that? Emily reeled in thought. Was that a figure she just saw standing next to Thomas? Almost as if a mirage, out of the corner of her eye. There she saw a black figure for a split second. She decided to let the scene play out for a few more seconds in an attempt to get another glimpse. There it was again. A black silhouette of a human-looking figure. A tallish man, though not quite as tall as Thomas. This happened a few more times, and each time it did, Thomas had a slight jolt in his affect, as if being prompted by it. As they finally made it to the beginning of the forested area with what looked to be around 30 children in tow, it happened one last time. Emily managed to freeze the scene the very moment it occurred. She then zoomed herself directly next to the silhouette to get a closer look. Getting closer, however, did not yield more clarity to the image, as if it were a human being phasing only partially into existence, a very noisy signal with no other discernible pattern. She did gather, though, that the silhouette looked to be some strange cross of two-dimensional and three-dimensional, as if one's shadow cast on a surface was halfway through the process of suddenly standing up from that surface. There was no real edge to it, but it stood out of the surroundings. As the congregation was again unpaused by Emily, she could see the Chinese soldiers storming the area beyond the horizon. Utter mayhem was ensuing, as if the very gates of hell had suddenly opened and all catastrophe was happening at once in a drastically collapsed time frame. Moments later, once Thomas had reached an impasse and lost any semblance of direction, a silhouette again appeared, then materialized into a man. He was wearing a gas mask, large green trench coat, and carried a scimitar in one hand. He had some type of assault rifle in the other. As he appeared undoubtedly a man from his stature and size, he beckoned Thomas toward him, to follow him. A white dove fluttering by in a paradoxical kind of unison. Surely, as if Emily had thought of the numerous times she had been nudged in the infinite spectrum of possibilities at her disposal to go in one particular direction, Thomas may have had a similar mentality to her. What else was she going to do? This was uncharted territory to him, and he was punching in the dark, all in order to give others hope. He kept none for himself, at least not yet, but this man, appearing from the ether, as if from nothingness itself, gave him some type of hope. Folly. It must have been folly. But was there a connection? Emily thought to herself in this situation of high strangeness, as so many paranormal researchers of her era would call it. No doubt about it. This was Thomas at his beginning, and therefore the masked man was probably the scientist. She watched him guide the congregation through the forested area, when moments later a cloud of green-tinted gas exploded behind Thomas, knocking him down. All those following him had expired, or were in the agony of the process after this explosion. choking as the gas destroyed their lungs and melted their flesh. So many children, such unimaginable suffering.